In 1988, the city of Avignon, with its charming streets and ancient stone buildings, housed a youth full of promises. Claire, her thoughts always focused on the future, was there for practical reasons with no great expectations. But that day, during the English class she was taking to improve her skills, fate, so capricious, was already weaving its threads. Marc, sitting to her left, seemed insignificant at first glance, but as the weeks passed, he became impossible to ignore. There was in him a mix of sensitivity and strength that began to invade Claire's thoughts. At that time, the feelings that arose in her chest were, for Claire, something new, unexpected, and almost painful. It was as if her soul, until then calm and serene, had been awakened by an uncontrollable force. Marc was, in his quiet way, deeply captivating. He looked at Claire with a calm curiosity, as if seeing something in her that no one else did. There was a silent connection between them, built on furtive glances and involuntary smiles, a bond that, although tenuous, was already unbreakable. In her heart, Claire began to feel a familiar confusion, as if the need to understand what was happening pulled her in several directions. She wondered if Marc felt the same, and her mind quickly got lost in suppositions and doubts. The memory of those afternoons shared in silence, when the French summer heat seemed to make time stop, became a kind of refuge. First love was blossoming, but like a flower growing among rocks, always conscious of the precariousness of its existence. Marc, on the other hand, observed Claire with an intensity that he himself barely understood. There was a gravity in her presence, a weight he couldn't name, but that filled his days in a way he couldn't explain. He had never been one for grand gestures, but with each silent encounter, he felt that Claire was different from anyone he had ever known. She awakened in him a desire to protect, to understand, but at the same time, a subtle fear that all of this might be an illusion. The love that was beginning to grow between them was, in a way, inevitable. The way Claire handled her books or the way Marc pretended to focus on lessons, when in truth he could hardly think of anything but her, it all seemed part of a grand plan that neither of them fully understood. Doubt, however, hovered like a shadow over their hearts, and neither dared to take the first step to confirm what they felt. And so, like a script written by destiny, life swept them toward the unknown. What Marc and Claire did not yet know was that this first meeting, seemingly simple and unassuming, would mark the beginning of a much more complex journey than they could have imagined. The stones of old Avignon had already silently witnessed so many love stories, and now they would again, with Claire and Marc as the protagonists of a narrative that was far from being written. The summer in Avignon brought with it the promise of long, sunny days, but as time passed, what began as a quiet romance between Claire and Marc quickly revealed itself to be more intense than they could handle. Youth, with all its impulsiveness, was at once their greatest ally and their greatest enemy. Jealousy, born of the uncertainty they both shared, poisoned what would otherwise have been a simple and pure love. Claire found herself torn between the desire to give herself fully and the fear of the consequences of an exposed heart. The relationship, which until then had blossomed as a sweet secret, quickly became the center of their existence. And it was at this point that the disagreements began. Small misunderstandings, fueled by insecurity, evolved into silent arguments, avoided glances, and a tension that seemed to grow with each new encounter. Marc, confused by the intensity of his own feelings, found himself unable to contain the jealousy he felt when he saw Claire with other classmates, and this only fed the distance between them. Claire's family, aware of what was happening, decided to intervene. Her parents, afraid that the emotional involvement would harm their daughter, made the decision to send her to Paris, a change that seemed abrupt, but in their eyes was necessary. The news hit Claire like a sudden storm. The idea of leaving Avignon, and even more painfully of being separated from Marc, unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. Her feelings for him, until then kept in a private space in her heart, suddenly became so clear and irreversible, like a current impossible to divert. The departure was quick, almost cruel in its execution. Marc learned of the decision too late to attempt any kind of resistance. He watched her for the last time at the school gate, where she used to wait for him after each class, but that day Claire no longer waited. All he could do was watch from a distance as she left, without words, just a look that seemed to carry the full weight of the farewell. It was as if the world had conspired to separate them, and both, too young to fight the inevitable, accepted the fate imposed on them. In Paris, Claire's life took a new course, but Marc remained a constant presence in her thoughts. The days passed in a blur, and no matter how much she tried to distract herself, Marc's absence weighed on her like a shadow she couldn't dispel. The distance between them was not just physical, but emotional as well. The love that had once blossomed so strongly now seemed to wither, suffocated by the harsh reality of separation. But despite everything, a part of Claire refused to believe that this was the end. Marc, in turn, felt powerless. He tried to keep in touch, writing letters that never received a reply. Life in Avignon without Claire lost its sparkle. The world that had once been full of promises now seemed empty, and he could find no consolation in anything other than the memories of their moments together. Youth, with its inexperience and pride, prevented any grand gesture of reconciliation. The silence that grew between them was like an insurmountable barrier, and what remained was only the longing for a love they both feared had been lost forever. Time has a strange way of altering the perception of what was once essential. For Claire, the years following her move to Paris brought changes she could never have predicted. New responsibilities, new faces, and eventually, new loves filled the spaces that Marc had once occupied in her heart. She married a young lawyer for the first time, who, though charming, never made her feel the same fervor she had experienced with Marc. And yet, Claire convinced herself that she was happy, that the past was nothing more than a distant and juvenile memory. Marc also moved on with his life in Avignon. He tried to rebuild his existence amidst the emotional ruins left by Claire. He met a young woman named Sophie, who brought with her a kind of calm that he thought he needed. He married her, hoping that married life would provide the stability that his intense love with Claire never had. But even in the routine of marriage, small things reminded him of Claire. A song playing in the distance, the familiar scent of perfume, or even the sunset they had watched together so many times. Fate, however, was relentless in its insistence. For both Claire and Marc, the memories of the past could not be easily erased. Claire, in her moments of solitude, often passed by the old school where she had studied, as if hoping in some way to catch a glimpse of the young man who had once waited for her there with such hope. The streets of Paris, though bustling, felt empty compared to the sunlit afternoons of Avignon. She had 2 children with her first husband, but the marriage, full of respect and affection, never filled the void left by her first love. For Marc, the 80s music that marked his youth, especially the songs from the Dirty Dancing soundtrack, became a portal to a lost time. Each note brought back the image of Claire, dancing by his side at school parties, laughing carefree, as if the world were a simple place full of possibilities. It was painful for him to admit that, despite his new life, he had never really let go of Claire. The love he had nurtured for her continued to live in some forgotten corner of his soul. The marriages of both, though begun with promises of happiness, proved fragile in the face of life's realities. After the death of her first husband, Claire tried once again to find happiness in marriage. However, fate repeated its cruelty, and her second husband also passed away prematurely, leaving her a widow for the second time. Marc, in turn, went through 2 divorces, as if searching for something that he knew deep down he would never find. Each new attempt to rebuild his life only seemed to reaffirm the loss of something that had once been pure and true. And so, both continued their lives separately, but the ghost of that youthful love never fully abandoned them. Marc and Claire, though in different cities and surrounded by new families, lived with the weight of memories that time had not been able to erase. The connection that had once united them, though weakened by distance and years, remained latent, like a timid flame waiting for the chance to be rekindled. But for both, it seemed that this love was now a relic of a life that could no longer be recovered. In 1994, fate, in its capricious nature, offered Marc and Claire a chance for redemption, an opportunity to reunite after so many years of silence. Marc, driven by a growing restlessness, learned through mutual friends that Claire had moved to Bordeaux. The idea of seeing her again, of finally dispelling the weight of so many unanswered questions, consumed his thoughts. He never imagined that in trying to find her, the memories of that youthful love would return with such intensity, as if no time had passed. Driven by a feeling he couldn't control, Marc decided to write to Claire, a letter filled with all that he had never said before. It was a letter of regrets, hopes, and above all, a desire for a new beginning. He put into words the longing he felt, the space she still occupied in his life, and his desire to somehow rediscover what they had lost. With a racing heart, Marc sent the letter, believing that this would be the key to restoring something that should never have ended. Claire, upon receiving the letter, felt her heart race. Years had passed since the last time she had thought of Marc with real intensity, but those words reopened wounds and awakened feelings she thought had long been dormant. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would have been like if things had been different. Perhaps if they had fought harder for the love they shared, their lives would have taken a different path. However, even with this new spark, doubt and distrust soon arose, fueled by a shadow she never could have expected. What Claire didn't know was that, shortly before Marc wrote to her, an ex-girlfriend of his had sent a letter to her home, filled with manipulative and resentful words. The woman, bitter over the breakup, made one last attempt to win Marc back, claiming that he still had feelings for her. Upon receiving the two letters in quick succession, Claire, already fragile with uncertainty, saw her fears materialize. It was as if fate, which had once separated them physically, was now separating them emotionally, without them even realizing it. The misunderstanding that followed was painfully predictable. Claire, feeling betrayed and vulnerable, didn't reply to Marc's letter. Her mind, entangled in confusion, concluded that the love they had shared, though true, belonged to the past, something idealized that could not survive in reality. She left Bordeaux and moved on to a new life, believing that the possibility of reconciliation was nothing more than a distant dream. The silence that responded to Marc's letter was deafening. Marc, disillusioned and confused, didn't know how to deal with the lack of response. He had hoped with such optimism for a reconnection, an opportunity to right the wrongs of the past, but Claire's silence was confirmation that perhaps their love truly had no place in their adult lives. Discouraged, he returned to Lyon, where he immersed himself once again in the routine of a life that, without Claire, seemed increasingly empty. The reunion that could have reignited the flames of their love had slipped through the unforgiving hands of fate, leaving them both adrift, separated once again by time and circumstances. Time was not kind to Claire and Marc. After the failed attempt at reconciliation, life seemed to move on mercilessly, and both were forced to go in opposite directions. Claire, still hurt by the misunderstanding, built a new life in Bordeaux. The grief over her two husbands, combined with the emotional distance she had always felt since her separation from Marc, made her feel like a spectator in her own existence. She moved on, but with a persistent feeling that something vital had been left behind. The years piled up relentlessly. For Claire, her second marriage offered brief moments of comfort, but never completely erased the memories of her first love. The challenges she faced, especially after the death of her second husband, made her stronger, but also more aware of life's fragility. In moments of deep introspection, she wondered if her heart had ever truly healed. Every time she passed by the school where she had met Marc, she felt the ghostly presence of a life that could have been. Marc, on the other hand, returned to Lyon after the failed attempt to reunite with Claire. He once again tried to build a life without her, seeking consolation in other relationships that never seemed to last. His 2 failed marriages were marked by a deep sense of lack, the feeling that he was always searching for something that could not be found in anyone else. Even amidst his daily obligations, there was a part of his soul that never stopped thinking of Claire. Though separated by circumstances, Claire and Marc, in their respective cities, lived under the same weight of the past. The music playing on the radio, the familiar streets they walked, the faces of strangers who for a moment reminded them of each other, all served as a reminder of what they had lost. And yet, fate continued to interfere in their lives, as if waiting for the right moment to intertwine their paths again. The love between them, though dormant, had never been completely extinguished. Friends and family around them knew little about this distant love, but they could see that something fundamental was missing in both their lives. There was an unfilled space, a void that no other relationship seemed able to cure. Even if they never admitted it, Marc and Claire carried with them a shared pain, as if the universe continued to conspire to keep them apart, yet bound by the same painful destiny. And so years passed, and though their lives moved in opposite directions, both clung to the hope, however vague, that fate, which had separated them so many times, might offer them a second chance. Both, in their moments of greatest vulnerability, wondered if true love ever truly disappears, or if it remains waiting for the right moment to be reborn. Years later, tired of the losses and loneliness life had inflicted on her, Claire decided to return to Avignon. Time, which had once taken her away from everything she loved, was now pushing her back to her roots. It was a trip she had long avoided, fearing the memories Avignon still held. However, she felt that something inside her was calling her to face the past, as if the closing of a cycle depended on this reconnection with the place where it had all begun. Claire, now a widow for the second time, found herself walking the familiar streets, searching for a peace she knew in some way she would only find there. One cloudy afternoon, while wandering aimlessly through the historic alleys of the city, Claire passed by the school where she had studied. She had avoided this part of Avignon for many years, fearing the weight of the memories, but that day something made her stop. It was then that she saw a large mural of photos, organized by former students to celebrate the school's many years of history. Curious, she slowly approached, looking at images faded by time, faces of young people she could barely recognize. However, one photo in particular caught her attention. It was a picture of her and Marc, taken during a school trip. The two stood side by side, smiling with an unassuming happiness that seemed to belong to another life. Claire felt her heart tighten at the sight of that image, and for a moment, she was transported back to that time. The photo, so simple in its nature, brought back a flood of emotions she thought she had left behind. The love she and Marc had shared seemed to revive through that image, awakening in her a deep desire to know what had happened to him. Driven by a mix of nostalgia and curiosity, Claire made the decision to look for Marc. She knew he was in Lyon, or at least that's what she had heard from friends many years ago. She didn't know if he was married, if he had children, or if he even remembered her with the same intensity. But something was pushing her to seek answers, as if somehow fate was offering her one last opportunity to understand what had remained of that youthful love. Meanwhile, Marc, who had never forgotten Claire, also felt the weight of nostalgia. After so many years without visiting Avignon, he decided to return to the city to visit a childhood friend. His life in Lyon, though seemingly stable, had never managed to fill the void Claire had left behind. It was as if a part of his story remained unfinished, and the simple thought of returning to that city awakened in him a quiet, yet persistent hope that fate might still have something to offer them. Without knowing it, their paths were beginning to converge once again. Fate, which had separated them so many times, now slowly moved them toward each other. Claire and Marc, each on their own individual journey, were walking toward a reunion they couldn't foresee. Life, in all its unpredictability, seemed ready to offer them a second chance. a chance that awaited them in the bustling markets and historic streets of Avignon, where their stories had first begun. The markets of Avignon were full of life that weekend. The narrow streets and colorful stalls were brimming with familiar aromas and carefree laughter. It was the kind of place Marc had always loved, a tangible reminder of the simplicity of his youth. He walked among the stalls, his eyes scanning the faces around him, but his mind was far away, lost in memories of a time when everything seemed easier. At every corner he found fragments of the past, as if the city were full of small reminders of what he couldn't forget. Claire was there too, driven by a restlessness she herself couldn't explain. After revisiting the school and being surprised by the photo mural, she allowed herself to wander the city, revisiting places that had once meant so much to her. Avignon was a labyrinth of memories, and every corner brought back a new sense of déjà vu. As she passed through the markets, the joyful sound of conversations and the smell of fresh fruit enveloped her in a melancholy she hadn't expected to feel. Even so, she kept walking, as if something was pulling her forward. And then it happened. Marc, distracted, bumped into Claire as he turned a corner. The impact was subtle, but enough for them both to stop, and for a brief moment their eyes met. The world around them seemed to dissolve, and all that existed was that instant, full of recognition and surprise. Claire saw him first, the features of Marc still so familiar despite the years, and his eyes, carrying the same mix of intensity and kindness. She stood frozen, unable to believe what she was seeing. For Marc, the shock was just as profound. There, standing before him, was Claire, more mature, of course, but with the same presence that had always drawn him in. He could barely process the coincidence of the encounter, but part of his heart already knew that this was no accident. It seemed that fate, tired of its own games, had finally decided to put them on the same path once again. The emotion of the reunion filled him in a way he had never expected, and for a moment, he felt as if the years of distance had vanished. Both stood still, unsure of how to react. Words seemed unnecessary at that moment. Everything they had felt, the pain of separation, the silent longing, and the uncertainty of the future, now seemed to align in a single point. The reunion they had imagined so many times was now happening so simply, as if it had always been destined to be this way. What had once been interrupted was now before them, asking to be resumed. And so, as the Avignon market carried on around them, Claire and Marc stood there, immersed in a silence that spoke more than any conversation could. The city that had once separated them was now bringing them together again, and although the future remained uncertain, the simple fact that they were together, once more, seemed to be all that mattered in that moment. Fate had finally intervened, and both knew that from that moment on, their lives would never be the same. The chance meeting at the Avignon market left Claire and Marc in a state of silent confusion. They hadn't exchanged more than glances, but the impact of that moment reverberated deeply in their hearts. In the days that followed, they met again, this time at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. The conversations, which began hesitantly, soon turned into reflections on the past, as if each word was a careful step toward healing the wounds that had never fully healed. Claire felt, with each meeting, the return of a feeling she thought she had lost forever. The love she had shared with Marc in their youth, though interrupted, was not dead. On the contrary, it seemed to have been preserved by time, matured by the experiences they had both lived through. Slowly, she allowed herself to feel that intense emotion again, though now it was tempered by the wisdom of a lifetime. Doubts, however, still lingered. Could such an old love truly blossom again? Marc, on the other hand, was determined. The reunion with Claire had filled him with a certainty he had never been able to find in all the years they had spent apart. Each word exchanged, each gesture shared, was a confirmation that the love between them had never disappeared. He looked at her with admiration, feeling grateful to have been blessed with a second chance. Life had taught him that true love was rarely easy, but for him, Claire had always been what was missing from his existence. On a golden afternoon, as the sun set over the lavender fields on the outskirts of Avignon, Marc made a decision. He knew he couldn't let fate interfere again. The fear of losing Claire once more drove him to act. Without ceremony, he approached a local radio station, known for broadcasting community stories, and asked to make a live announcement. There were no elaborate plans, just the desire to finally speak what his heart had held onto for so many years. That evening, as Claire listened to the radio absent-mindedly in her home, Marc's voice echoed through the room, surprising her. He spoke directly to her, his voice full of emotion. He expressed how much seeing her again had brought meaning back to his life, and in a public plea, he asked for her hand in marriage. It was a bold gesture, full of sincerity, something Claire would never have expected from him. Marc's words resonated in her heart, and as she listened to the proposal, silent tears rolled down her cheeks. Claire's answer could not have been any different. Deep down, she knew that this love, the same one that had crossed so many barriers, deserved another chance. Marc, with all the simplicity of his gesture, had rekindled a flame she thought was extinguished. The love that united them now was stronger, more resilient, and for the first time in a long while, Claire felt she could allow herself to be truly happy. Fate, at last, seemed to have reconciled with them, offering the redemption they had both been seeking. Claire's response to Marc's proposal couldn't have been clearer. The next morning, they met again, this time with the certainty that fate had finally guided them to the right place. The city of Avignon, with its stone streets and bustling markets, seemed to envelop them in a kind of silent embrace, as if it were witnessing a cycle finally coming to a close. Marc, with an expression of serenity he hadn't felt in years, took Claire's hand, and together they began to plan the future that, for so long, had been denied to them. It didn't take long for the entire city to hear about the reunion and the proposal. Marc's gesture on the radio had become the most talked about event in Avignon. Childhood friends, family members, and even strangers celebrated the story of the couple that fate had separated, but who now, against all odds, had found their way back to love. There was something deeply inspiring about their narrative, something that made people believe, even if only for a moment, in the power of second chances. The wedding ceremony, planned in a simple and intimate way, was set to take place in the lavender fields of Provence, a place both Claire and Marc had always loved. The natural setting, with its vast expanses of fragrant purple, seemed like the perfect backdrop for a love that had survived the trials of time. On the day of the wedding, the sky was clear, and the sun, low on the horizon, bathed the field in a soft golden light. In the distance, the sound of laughter and music filled the air, as friends and family awaited the couple. When Claire appeared in the field, wrapped in a simple white dress, Marc's eyes filled with emotion. For him, that moment was the culmination of a lifetime of longing and waiting. She walked toward him with a serenity that only true love could provide. The flowers around her, the gentle breeze, and the sound of voices in the background seemed to blend into perfect harmony. It was as if everything had been designed especially for them, as if the universe had finally conspired in their favor. The words they exchanged that day were few, but filled with meaning. The wedding, so long anticipated and imagined for so many years, was finally becoming a reality. And in that moment, both Claire and Marc realized that the love they shared was more than just a romantic connection. It was a story of redemption, perseverance, and above all, faith. They had faced adversity, endured separations, and in the end, found their way back to each other. As the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Claire and Marc became husband and wife. The celebration was small, with only the closest people present, but the love that filled that place was immense. Their story, so full of twists and obstacles, was now ending with a happy conclusion in the fragrant fields of Provence. And as they walked together through the rows of lavender, hand in hand, there was an unshakable certainty that this time, nothing would ever separate them again. The story of Claire and Marc reminds us that true love, the kind that touches our souls deeply, never truly fades. Claire and Marc were separated by circumstances and misunderstandings, but the flame they kindled in their youth survived, even in the face of life's hardships. This story shows us that sometimes fate can be cruel, but also generous, offering second chances when we least expect them. The beauty of their reunion makes us reflect on the strength of love and its ability to transform us, even after years apart. In the end, what really matters is that true love always finds its way back. If you enjoyed this emotional story and believe in the power of love that overcomes time, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming stories. Share this video with your friends and family so they too can be moved by this inspiring journey. Let's spread the power of love and second chances together.